Sadie Calloway was 43 years old when she stood in a muddy churchyard in Ashford Crossing, Kansas, and watched her brother-in-law nail a notice to the door of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and loved for 19 years. Silas Calloway, a man with a banker's smile and a snake's patience, had waited only 6 weeks after his brother's death to claim that the land had always been his by an unwritten debt, and the county judge, who owed Silas more favors than Sadie owed anyone a kindness, had signed the paper without blinking. She left with a wagon, a trunk of her mother's linens, and $11.40 sewn into the hem of her second-best dress. 3 days later, at a sheriff's auction nobody else wanted to attend, she paid 9 of those dollars for the old Kellen grist mill on Willow Fork Creek, a crumbling, silent thing the whole town had given up on years before. They called her a fool to her face. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that sealed behind the mill's rusted gears sat a secret that would not only save her, but would call home a face the town had long ago buried in memory, and would set right a wrong that had waited 30 years for justice. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Sadie Calloway. If you're watching this from a place that others have written off as finished, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Sadie had been born Sadie Whitfield in 1838 in a low stone house beside her father's flour mill on the Solomon River, a mile outside a settlement that had not yet earned the name Ashford Crossing. Her father, Reuben Whitfield, was a miller the way some men are preachers. Not merely by trade, but by temperament, a patient, quiet man who believed that grain, like people, revealed its worth only to those willing to slow down and pay attention to it. He taught Sadie to read the color of wheat by lamplight, to know by the sound of the stones whether the grind was too coarse or too fine, to understand that a mill was not a machine so much as a covenant between a community and its harvest. Farmers for 30 miles brought their grain to Reuben Whitfield because he never cheated a bushel, never let a rich man's wagon go ahead of a poor man's, and never turned away a family that could not pay until the next season. Sadie grew up believing that this was simply what it meant to be useful in the world, to take what others discarded or undervalued and to treat it with the seriousness it deserved. She had a younger brother, Thomas, for years her junior, a bright-eyed, restless boy who loved the river more than he loved the mill, who would rather be skipping stones at the ford than sweeping flour dust from the loft. Sadie adored him with a fierce, half-motherly love that oldest sisters often carry, and on the June morning in 1852, when the Solomon rose without warning after 3 days of hard rain upstream, it was Sadie who first noticed Thomas was not in the yard. The flood that spring was the worst anyone in the valley had ever seen, a brown, roaring wall of water that tore out the footbridge, swallowed the lower pasture, and by the time the Whitfield family and their neighbors had formed a search line along the banks, there was no sign of the boy at all. Only a straw hat caught in a willow root 2 miles downstream, and a grief that never fully left the house again. Reuben Whitfield searched the riverbanks for 3 years before he stopped speaking of it, and something in Sadie's mother went quiet forever after that summer. They held a small service with no body to bury, and Sadie learned, at 9 years old, the particular ache of loving someone whose ending you are never given the comfort of knowing. It was grief, in its strange way, that shaped the woman Sadie became. She learned to work with her hands because busy hands left less room for sorrow. She learned patience because she had watched her father wait, year after year, for news that never came, as she had seen that a person could carry an unanswered question for a lifetime and still rise each morning to do good work. She learned, above all, never to mistake a thing's condition for its worth. Not a battered sack of wheat, not a stray dog, not a broken fence, and, though she could not have known it then, not a rusted, forgotten mill. When she was 20, she married Micah Calloway, a steady, soft-spoken cattleman with kind eyes and a laugh that came easily, and she moved with him to a modest spread 11 miles east of Ashford Crossing, where together they raised corn, a small herd, and in time, enough goodwill among their neighbors that people said the Calloway Gate was always open to a hungry traveler. Micah's younger brother Silas was a different sort of man entirely. Ambitious, calculating, forever measuring his worth against his brother's happiness and finding himself wanting. But for 19 years Sadie, kept the peace between the brothers the way she kept everything else, with steadiness, with patience, and with a quiet refusal to let bitterness take root where kindness could grow instead. Micah Calloway died in the late autumn of 1880, thrown from a spooked horse while bringing in the last of the herd before the first hard freeze. And it was in the raw, disoriented weeks that followed his burial that Sadie learned exactly how little the world protected a widow who owned no paper with her own name on it. Silas came to her not with sympathy, but with a ledger, claiming that Micah had borrowed heavily against the land years before to cover a bad season, that the debt had never been settled, and that as the nearest male relation and the holder of the note, the farm and everything on it now belonged to him. Sadie knew, in the marrow of her bones, that this was a lie. Micah had been careful with money to the point of stubbornness, and she had never once seen a note bearing his signature to his brother. But knowing a thing and proving it to a county judge who dined at Silas Calloway's table were two very different matters. The judge, a heavy-set man named Orrin Beck, who owed his seat in no small part to Silas's influence over the local bank, signed a transfer without asking Sadie a single question, and within 6 weeks of burying her husband, Sadie Calloway found herself standing in her own dooryard while strangers hired by Silas carried her furniture onto a wagon that was not, she was informed, hers to keep either. The town of Ashford Crossing watched this happen with the particular helplessness of people who suspect an injustice but lack the standing to challenge it. A few of Sadie's oldest friends, women who had shared quilting frames and church suppers with her for 2 decades, pressed coins into her hand when Silas wasn't looking and would not meet his eye when he was. But no one stopped it. Sadie left with what she could carry: her mother's linens, a chest of her father's old milling tools that Silas had no use for and did not bother to claim, a good wagon horse named Bramble that had technically belonged to her outright, and $11.40 that she had. In a moment of foresight, she would later be grateful for all her life, sewn into the hem of her dress rather than leaving in the house. She was 43 years old, a widow with no children of her own, no land, no standing, and no clear notion of where she would sleep come winter. It would have been easy, at that point, to become bitter, to let the injustice curdle into permanent grief the way it had curdled something in her mother after Thomas was lost. Instead, on a gray morning 3 days after she left the only home she had known as a wife, Sadie heard that the county was auctioning off an old, abandoned grist mill on Willow Fork Creek to settle unpaid taxes, and something in her, some old, patient instinct inherited from her father, told her to go and look at it before she decided what kind of woman grief was going to make of her. The mill had belonged, decades before, to a solitary man named Ezra Kellen, who had built it sometime around 1859, and run it quietly for years before age, and failing eyesight forced him to let the business fall away. Kellen had died 2 winters past with no known kin, no will that anyone could find, and the mill had sat crumbling on its foundation ever since, its will choked with silt, its stones gone green with moss, its roof sagging like the back of an old horse. The creek itself had shifted slightly over the years, leaving the mill race half-starved of water, and most folks in Ashford Crossing considered the whole property worthless, a relic, a ruin, a place children were warned away from and men joked about at the feed store. When Sadie arrived at the auction, held on the mill's own weed-choked porch by a board deputy reading numbers off a county ledger, she was the only bidder who raised a hand at all. $9 bought her the mill house behind it, and the 4 acres it sat upon, and the deputy laughed, not unkindly, as he wrote out her deed, remarking that she'd paid $9 for a pile of rust and regret. Word of it spread through town within the week, and Sadie began to hear herself spoken of in the particular tone reserved for the foolish and the pitiable. Poor Sadie Calloway, robbed of her home, and now throwing away what little she had left on Ezra Kellen's ruin. She did not much care what they said. She had grown up in a mill, had grease and grain dust in her blood the way other women had needlework, and she understood something the town did not, that a mill's worth was never in its condition on the day you found it, but in whether the bones beneath the rust were sound. She moved into the small mill house with Bramble stabled in the lean-to, and on her first full day as the owner of Kellen's mill, She took a lantern and walked the length of the grinding floor, running her hand along the great iron gears the way her father had taught her, feeling for cracks, for weakness, for the places where 30 years of neglect had done real damage rather than merely cosmetic. It was in doing this, crouched low beside the main drive gear, checking the teeth for wear by lamplight, that her fingers found something that should not have been there, a seam in the old oak housing behind the gear, too straight, too deliberate to be the work of rot or time. She worked at it for the better part of an hour before a small panel came loose in her hands, and behind it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, she found a leather-bound journal and a small tin box. Both of them placed there, it was plain to see, by someone who had wanted them, found only by a person patient enough to look. She did not read the journal that first night. She was too tired, too raw from the losses stacked one atop another, and some old instinct told her that whatever waited inside deserved a clear head and a settled heart. It was 3 evenings later, after she had swept the grinding floor clean and patched the worst of the roof with scrap tin, that she finally sat by the fire with Ezra Kellen's journal open on her knee and began, slowly, to understand why he had hidden it where only a true miller's hands would ever find it. The journal began plainly enough, with notes on grain prices and repairs to the wheel, the ordinary record-keeping of a working man. But threaded through the later pages, in a hand that grew shakier with the years, was another story entirely, one Ezra Kellen had apparently never told a living soul. In the spring of 1852, he wrote, during the worst flood the valley had ever seen, he had been walking the swollen bank of the Solomon River searching for a lost calf when he found, tangled in willow roots 2 miles downstream of the Whitfield mill, a half-drowned boy of perhaps 5 years, breathing but senseless, with no family in sight and no way, in the chaos of that terrible week, to learn where he belonged. Kellen had been a solitary man even then, new to the valley, unmarried and uncertain of his welcome among neighbors who did not yet know him, and in the confusion of the flood's aftermath. Roads washed out, families scattered, communication near impossible for weeks. He had done what frightened, well-meaning men sometimes do. He had taken the boy home to nurse him back to health, intending to find his family once the waters receded, and then had waited too long and grown too attached and let fear and love tangled together into silence. By the time the roads were passable again, he told himself the boy's family must surely believe him dead and buried, that reopening the wound would serve no one, that the child himself, too young and too fevered at the time to remember much, had begun to call him Pa, and to believe, in the trusting way of small children, that this was simply his life now. Kellen raised the boy as his own under the name Daniel Kellen, and never once, in nearly 30 years, told him the truth of where he had come from. Sadie read this passage with her hands shaking so badly she had to set the journal down twice, because she understood, with a certainty that seized her chest like a fist, that the flood Ezra Kellen described, the exact bend of river, the willow roots, the straw hat lost 2 miles downstream, was her own family's flood, the one that had taken her brother Thomas and had never given her family so much as a body to grieve over. She read on late into the night, forgetting supper, forgetting the ache in her back from a day's labor, and learned that Daniel Kellen had grown into a capable, gentle young man who had left the valley at 19 to work the river trade, ferrying goods and passengers along the Missouri, and had eventually settled far upriver in a town called Blue Bend, where the last entry, written only weeks before Ezra Kellen's death, noted that Daniel had married and was, by all accounts Ezra had gathered, through occasional letters, doing well as a ferryman and small rancher, unaware even now of the truth of his own beginning. The final page of the journal was the closest thing to a confession Sadie had ever read, an old man's admission that he had meant, every year for 30 years, to write to the Whitfield family and confess what he had done, and had every year lost his nerve, until illness and time had finally taken the choice from him, and he had done the only thing his conscience would allow, hidden the truth where, if the Lord willed it, someone patient enough and worthy enough might one day find it and set it right. The tin box held the rest, a small, tarnished locket that had belonged to Sadie's own mother, one that Sadie recognized instantly, because she had a matching one herself, tucked in her mother's trunk of linens, the pair having been split between the two Whitfield children as infants in the old custom of the valley. A folded letter addressed simply to whoever finds this, in God's name be kind, and a small hand-drawn map of the river route to Blue Bend, some 140 miles upstream, marked in Ezra Kellen's careful, apologetic hand. Sadie sat with these things until the fire burned to embers, weeping the tears she had not allowed herself to weep for her husband, for her stolen farm, for a brother she had mourned for 30 years and now understood, with an emotion too large and strange to have a single name, might still be alive. Word travels quickly in a small town. Even word a woman means to keep close, and it was not many weeks before rumors began drifting through Ashford Crossing that Sadie Calloway had found something valuable hidden in the old Kellen mill. Gold, some said, or a deed to land no one knew about, or a fortune Ezra Kellen had supposedly hoarded away in his solitary years. Sadie had told no one but the town's aging doctor, a trusted friend of her late father's named Dr. Amos Rayburn, and had sworn him to secrecy, but a stranger had seen her poring over the map at the mercantile counter while asking after the safest river route north, and speculation, once loosed, could not be called back. It reached Silas Calloway within the month, and Silas, whose ambition had only sharpened since he'd taken his brother's farm, saw in the rumor an opportunity too tempting to ignore. He rode out to the mill himself on a bright, cold morning, all false warmth and brotherly concern, and suggested to Sadie that since the mill's tax deed had technically been irregular, a claim he had no real grounds for, but made with the same confident authority that had won him her farm, perhaps it would be simplest and kindest to her if he took the property off her hands for a fair price and let her keep whatever trinkets she'd found inside. Sadie, who had spent 19 years learning the exact shape and weight of Silas Calloway's greed, refused him plainly and without apology, and watched something cold settle behind his eyes that told her the matter was far from finished. Within the week, Silas had gone to Judge Beck once more, this time arguing that the mill's original tax sale had been improperly conducted, that as a woman without clear legal standing Sadie could not rightfully hold the deed at all, and that the property ought to revert to the county for resale. Resale, everyone understood, that Silas intended to win. The town, which had laughed at Sadie for buying a ruin, now watched with a different kind of interest as word spread that there might be treasure in the old mill after all, and Sadie found herself in the strange position of being pitted one month and eyed with suspicion the next, her neighbors uncertain whether to see her as a fool or a woman sitting on a secret fortune. Judge Beck set a hearing for the 3rd week of April, giving Sadie barely a month to either prove her claim to the mill was sound or lose it, along with everything hidden inside it, exactly as she had lost her farm. Dr. Rayburn, who had known Reuben Whitfield since before Sadie was born and who remembered the flood of 1852 as though it were yesterday, became her steadiest ally in those anxious weeks. It was he who helped her track down the county's original flood-era records, still gathering dust in the courthouse basement, and who confirmed in writing that the Whitfield family had indeed lost a young son, Thomas, presumed drowned, in the very flood Ezra Kellen described, lending official weight to what had until then been only a grieving woman's private certainty. It was he, too, who gently urged her to consider a harder truth, that even with the journal, the locket, and the county records in hand, none of it would matter in Judge Beck's courtroom unless she could produce the one piece of proof that could not be argued with, the man himself, alive, and willing to say who he believed himself to be. And so, with the hearing bearing down on her and the mill's fate hanging in the balance, Sadie made the decision that would define the whole of what came after. Rather than spend her remaining weeks and her remaining dollars fighting Silas Calloway in a courtroom stacked against her, she would take Bramble, the map, and what little money she had left, and travel the 140 miles to Blue Bend to find out, with her own eyes, whether the boy in Ezra Kellen's journal truly was the brother she had buried in memory 30 years before. The journey took her the better part of 8 days, along river roads still soft with spring mud, through towns that offered her a barn to sleep in or a meal at a stranger's table with the particular generosity that frontier people, whatever their other faults, rarely failed to extend to a woman traveling alone with honest purpose. She reached Blue Bend on a clear, cold evening in early April and found a modest, hard-working river town not unlike Ashford Crossing, its main street busy with the ordinary business of a place that had learned to make its living off the water. She asked after the ferry and was directed to a landing at the north end of town, where a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s was securing a flat-bottomed boat against the current. His sleeves rolled to the elbow, his manner easy and unhurried in the way of men who trust the river and are trusted by it in turn. Sadie stood on the bank for a long moment before she could make herself speak, studying his face for something familiar and finding it at last in the particular set of his eyes and the shape of his jaw, features she recognized because she saw a trace of them every morning in her own reflection, and had seen them, too, in the small portrait of their father that hung, or had once hung, above her mother's hearth. She did not announce herself as his sister. She approached instead as a traveler seeking passage, and in the quiet minutes while he readied the ferry, she asked him, carefully, whether his name had always been Daniel Kellen, and watched something flicker across his face, an old, half-buried unease he could not quite name, before he admitted, slowly, that he did not, in truth, remember much of his life before the age of 5, that his father Ezra had always said he'd been found after a flood, and that he had never pressed the matter. Further, because Ezra Kellen had been, in every way that mattered, a good and loving father, and Daniel had not wanted, as a young man, to seem ungrateful by asking for more. Sadie reached in her satchel then and drew out the 2 lockets, her mother's, and its match, the one that had lain hidden in the tin box behind Ezra Kellen's careful lie for 30 years, and held them out to him, side by side, and watched a grown man's composure fall away entirely as he understood, all at once, what she had traveled 140 miles to tell him. They sat together on the riverbank until well past dark, Sadie telling him everything. Their father's mill, their mother's grief, the straw hat caught in the willow roots, the 30 years of unanswered wondering, and Daniel, who would in time come to answer to the name Thomas Whitfield again, though never quite let go of the name Ezra, had given him either. Listening with the particular stillness of a man rebuilding the foundation of his own identity in real time. He wept, in the end, not for himself, but for Ezra Kellen, whose love for him had been entirely genuine, even as it had been built upon a lie he had never found the courage to correct, and Sadie found she could not entirely condemn the old man either, understanding, as few others could, how grief and fear together could make even good people do things they would spend a lifetime regretting. What mattered now, they agreed, sitting together as siblings for the first time in 3 decades, was not to punish the dead for their weakness, but to make something worthy of the truth now that it had finally surfaced. Thomas returned with her to Ashford Crossing, arriving 3 days before Judge Beck's hearing was set to begin, and his presence alone did more to settle the town's uncertainty than any document could have. Here, after all, was a face that older residents of the valley, those who remembered Reuben Whitfield's mill and the terrible flood of 1852, could look upon and recognize something true in. The particular tilt of the Whitfield brow, the same quiet, watchful patience Sadie herself carried. Dr. Rayburn's county records, Ezra Kellen's own confessional journal, and the living testimony of Thomas Whitfield himself, standing in Judge Beck's courtroom and telling, in his own plain words, everything he now understood about his own beginnings, made the question of Sadie's claim to the mill almost an afterthought. Judge Beck, who had been prepared to rule in Silas Calloway's favor on the strength of influence alone, found himself facing a courtroom full of townsfolk who had come not out of idle curiosity, but out of genuine, moved attention, in a case that no longer had any honest legal footing to stand on. He ruled, with visible reluctance, that the original tax sale had been entirely proper and that the mill belonged, without further dispute, to Sadie Calloway. Silas's scheme, once exposed to daylight, revealed itself to be uglier than mere land greed. In pressing his claim to the mill, he had let slip, in his eagerness before the judge, details of his own grain dealings that made plain what half the farmers in the valley had long suspected but never been able to prove, that Silas had spent years quietly buying up the milling business of the county, undercutting competitors and pressuring struggling farmers into unfavorable contracts, using the very debt forgiveness schemes he'd once used against his own brother's widow to trap poorer families into selling their harvest to him at prices he alone controlled. With Kellen's mill restored and back in honest, capable hands that, unlike Silas's, remembered exactly what their own father had taught them about never turning away a poor man's wagon. Farmers who had quietly resented Silas's grip on their livelihoods for years began, one by one, to bring their grain instead to Sadie. And Silas Calloway watched his carefully built monopoly crumble not through any act of vengeance on Sadie's part, but simply through the plain, patient competition of a mill, run with integrity. No court ever punished him for what he had done to Sadie or to the valley's farmers. The justice that found him was quieter than that, and in some ways more complete. The slow, certain justice of a community choosing, once it finally had the choice, not to reward a man who had built his fortune on other people's desperation. Sadie and Thomas spent that summer and the seasons that followed rebuilding Kellen's mill together, clearing the silted mill race, repairing the great wheel, replacing worn gears with new ones forged in the county seat, until the old stones began to turn again for the first time in years, grinding grain for a community that had once dismissed the whole enterprise as a dead woman's foolish gamble. Thomas eventually split his time between his ferry business in Blue Bend and the mill that had, in its strange roundabout way, given him back his true name, while Sadie took up permanent residence in the mill house, becoming in time exactly the kind of miller her father had been: patient, exacting, generous with those who could not always pay on time, and utterly unwilling to let a person or a possession's rough condition fool her about its true worth. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman standing in a muddy churchyard with nothing but a wagon, a trunk, and $11.40 sewn in her hem, a woman the whole town called a fool for spending 9 of those dollars on a ruin nobody else wanted. What Sadie Calloway understood, and what her father had spent a lifetime teaching her without either of them quite knowing why it would matter so much, was that value is rarely where the crowd expects to find it, and that the things we are quickest to write off, a rusted mill, a grieving widow, a boy pulled half-drowned from a flooded river 30 years gone, are sometimes exactly where the truest riches are waiting to be found, sealed away, patient, for someone willing to look closely enough, and long enough to find them. She did not buy the mill to grow rich. She bought it because something in her refused to believe that a thing's worst season was the whole of its story, and in the end, that refusal gave her back not merely a livelihood, but a brother, a community restored to fairness, and a name: Sadie Calloway, miller's daughter, miller's widow, and finally, again, a sister that Ashford Crossing would never again speak with pity. We hope Sadie's story reminded you, as it reminded us, that overlooked things are so often waiting only for someone patient enough to notice them. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a little hope tonight, and we'd love to hear your answer to this in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and for letting Sadie's story sit a while in your heart. Until next time, stay close.